Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thanks so much for your patience. Welcome to Clockshop. Welcome to the sixth and final event in the third Los Angeles project at Occidental College. I'm Christopher Hawthorne, the architecture critic at the Los Angeles Times and the director of the third LA project. It's really my pleasure to welcome all of you here. This was something of an experiment, tonight's event. It was the first two-part event that we had. We started with a walk along the other side of the river at 6 o'clock. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you were with us for that portion of the program? Most of you. That was great. I was just saying to somebody that usually I drink a lot of Diet Coke before I get ready to moderate a panel, and I think I'm going to start taking long walks along the LA River instead because I really feel energized and really energized to be in that landscape, as I think all of you can understand. It's really fantastic to be out there and to think about the potential of that space. And that really, I was just saying to Michael Maltzan, really emblematic of, I think, the potential of the third Los Angeles as we've described it, to have a piece of land of that size in the geographical center of the city that we're now starting to have this debate about. What should it look like? How should it be designed? You know, they're not always reasons for confidence about us making the right decisions, but certainly for a city of LA's size to be hashing out those basic questions about what this landscape looks like, what this river looks like, it's a really tremendous opportunity and really symbolic of the kind of opportunities we've been talking about in all of these projects. So as the last event, it's, you know, I don't want to do too much summing up, but I do, again, really want to thank everyone at Occidental College who has been so instrumental in helping put this series together, in particular Lisa Suarez. Where's Lisa? Is she in the back? Lisa, who has really made all of these projects run smoothly. A number of people, when we started, said, "What, you're going to do 6 public projects in 2 months, and it's connected to a class, and they're going to be at 5 different venues." That sounds insane, and it's really only Lisa who's made it possible to do that, and things have run really smoothly thanks to her. And also Brett Schrader and Jim Tranquata at Oxy have been, from the very beginning, instrumental in understanding the potential of this project and making it happen. And my thanks to them as well. And back at Oxy to Jorge Gonzalez, President Jonathan Veach. Also to Julia Meltzer, who you will hear from very soon, the director of Clockshop. Thank you so much for having us here in this beautiful spot. Thank you to David Thorne for the food. I'm sure all of you enjoyed that remarkable spread that was really terrific. That's what makes this particular place so unusual, a combination of landscape, architecture, food, culture, all wrapped up in one venue, which is one of the reasons we wanted to try to be here for this conversation about the river. And finally to Sean Woods, broken ankle and all, who's in the front row, who was brave enough to lead our tour from crutches along the river. And I've had that same injury, so I can completely relate to what you're going through. It was really terrific of you to be there and give us that guidance. So here's the format for tonight's event. We will have several Oxy students get things started with some readings and a short film clip starring Lewis McAdams, the founder of the Friends of Los Angeles River. And then we'll have a panel discussion of about 45 minutes in length with Julia, with Michael Maltzan, Barbara Romero, and Carol Armstrong. I will introduce them in full later on, and then we'll save a little bit of time for questions from the audience. We haven't done that at every event, but I think given the kind of intelligence about the river that's in this room, it would be a shame not to. And let me do what I've done at all these events and have a quick quiz of the audience. How many of you live in the neighborhood, Frogtown, Elysian Valley, or close by? How many of you do work that's connected to the river, one way or another, directly or indirectly? Who is connected to Oxy, student or staff, faculty? Terrific. How many of you have been to at least one other Third LA event? Terrific. 2 others? You can keep your hands up. 3? Wow, so a number of you have been to 4. 4 other events? And 5, anybody who's been with us for all? Terrific. Just a few in the front. Well, I'm glad you're sitting so close. Thank you. You get a prize, some kind of a prize. Again, it's really been our goal from the beginning of this series to get out into the city. We had 3 of the 6 events on the Oxy campus. We had 3 of them out in the city, one in Koreatown at the Line Hotel. And then 2 weeks ago, we were at the Schindler House for a conversation about the single-family house in LA and some future housing models. And finally here, close to the LA River at Clockshop. But to kick things off, since this is the final event, we're going to have a reading from a student that's not connected to the river. This was something that an Occidental student, a piece that an Occidental student, Samuel Wiley, wrote. Several people forwarded it to me and asked me to look at it, and it's a really terrific piece of writing that I think is as a kind of invocation, as a kind of tribute to Los Angeles, seemed really fitting to have as part of this final event. So Samuel, who's a senior, is that right, Samuel? Where are you? Yes, senior at Occidental, is going to read a piece called For Los Angeles, a Love Letter. Please welcome Samuel Wiley.
Thank you. Dear Los Angeles, as of now, we have 42 days left together, exactly 6 weeks, before I will wake up in a different city. To say goodbye, I want to say thank you. I was 16 the first time I really noticed you. I was in English class, and our teacher gave us a short story by a writer I did not know. The story was unnerving. Its language was delicate in some places and deeply twisted in others, like wildflowers growing through a wrought iron fence. It was Joan Didion's Los Angeles Notebook, and it moved me to the point that I went in search of her works. So the first things I knew about you were all the ways you could estrange and mangle my psyche. This, of course, was balanced by all your stereotypes of glamour and superficial living. The world loves to hate you, and I had my doubts at one time, too. Now I simply laugh at the laziness of those who have never taken the time to get to know you. Or I feel pity for those who are still enamored of some other city and are pained by their separation. After some time, and for many reasons, I found myself standing on your doorstep with everything I owned. I had enrolled at Occidental and began to discover an entirely new world in you. College life accelerated both my excitement and my opportunities. That September, a professor took us on a class architecture tour of downtown. I stood at the base of the Bunker Hill skyscrapers and learned about the houses that were bulldozed to make way for them. We watched clips of Blade Runner in the Bradbury Building and passed through Santee Alley. I had the misfortune of biting into a habanero pepper hidden in my rice at a food stand. It was a perfect, kitschy introduction. I began to fall in love with you a little time after that. One night, my friend and I went to dinner. We spent way too much money and walked around afterward, trying to figure out what to do with the remaining bills in our pockets. We stumbled into a dingy movie theater with a midnight showing of Pulp Fiction on the original 35mm. Everyone's drunk except us. It was so raucous we couldn't hear the lines, but I knew them by heart, and it didn't matter. When we came out of the theater, the city was swathed in fog. The drive home was magically quiet. I still think you're most beautiful at night, when the fog reaches all the way up to the San Gabriels. I had never lived in a city before, and I found myself captivated by the immensity of it. I came to value the changes I could see from behind a car window. The first-ring suburbs with their eclectic craftsmen, Spanish and Victorian houses, graffiti-covered warehouses along the concrete river, the unappreciated urbanity of downtown, tree-lined estates on mid-city avenues, the square stucco apartment complexes of the West Side working class, the crisp gold hills that always seem to need water, the termination of everything when it meets the ocean. I found diversity in people the same way I found diversity in spaces. My sophomore year, a friend took me on a citywide hunt for the best pho. Another night, from a coffee shop window, I watched hundreds march past me in the Occupy protests. On buses, I hear languages I don't recognize, dialects I can't understand, and references to places I never knew existed. On Sundays, I listen to ranchera blaring from backyards as the smells of barbecue cover the neighborhood. Within this sprawl are a million ways to live, 1,000 micro-communities that rippled outward over the last century until they collided and accidentally became a city. Los Angeles, I love you for many reasons. I love you for your guile, your brush-hidden freeway entrances, and your impossible traffic patterns. I love that you're overcast in June and 90 degrees in January. I love you for your courage, your houses perched on sheer hills, and your cultural disregard for any city that came before you. I even love you for your faults, that thought of apocalypse every time I feel a vibration. Through you, I have learned to be kind. You taught me to coexist with 10 million people I will never have the chance to meet. You taught me how to get lost and how to find my way back home. You taught me I'm allowed to loosen my grip, that I'm allowed to be gay, I'm allowed to be weird, and I'm allowed to mess up. Most important, you taught me that I am insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe and how freeing it is to know that. So here I am, once more, on your doorstep with everything I own. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm sure glad I met you. I'm a better man for it. Yours, Samuel.
Thank you so much, Samuel. That was terrific. And now to the LA River, I want to say a few words about why I chose this as the theme for the final event of the series before I bring up a few more Oxy students. I really thought the river would make a fitting subject and backdrop for one of these events, and particularly the last event, not just because today is Earth Day, which is really a coincidence more than anything, but because there's really no part of the natural or built environment here that is as emblematic of the three Los Angeleses as the river. As I mentioned during the opening event in February, up until the late 1930s, we had a first LA river, untamed, seasonal, but unpredictable. After the war, we had a second LA river. I'm going to use this as a makeshift podium, channelized, wrapped in concrete by the Army Corps of Engineers in Washington, and entirely predictable, a cousin of the freeway in its desire for total control, a kind of monoculture, a product of what Jared Orsi in his terrific book, Hazardous Metropolis, calls the perfect hydraulic regime, no longer deadly but deadened in many ways. And now we're trying to imagine, to design, to create a third Los Angeles River with restored ecosystems and wildlife accessible to the public at many new locations, a spine of the emerging LA bike network, certainly also a place to think about the complicated relationship between nature and culture in the second biggest city in the United States. And if the second LA was about expansion toward the boundary of suburban development, the edge being pushed ever outward, the third LA is about a doubling back, a city and a region turning in on itself, looking again at the places and the people and the neighborhoods, for that matter, it left behind, abandoned, closed off, or forgot about during the great post-war boom. And none of those forgotten spaces, it seems to me, has more potential for reinvention than the Los Angeles River, which runs roughly 50 miles, 51, 52, some say 48 miles altogether, about a little less than 2/3 of that in the city of LA. In a city that has grown notably park poor in its built-out midsection and whose great open spaces, the beaches in particular, tend to lie along the periphery of the region, the river running through land that is already public is an opportunity hiding in plain sight to rediscover, reanimate, and repair the civic realm in the city, which is, as we've said in nearly every one of these events so far, is the chief challenge, the central effort of the third Los Angeles. And if the notion that we should locate our more utopian hopes for the third LA in a river that's wrapped in concrete, that a good deal of the time has virtually no water in it, consider that in Thomas More's utopia, the main river has a name that is usually translated as no water or without water. And so remembering that More's title itself, utopia, means no place, then by all means let's not be afraid of shamelessly utopian planning for our waterless river, finding potential there, not despite its seeming placelessness, but maybe because of it. There are virtually endless ways to talk about the LA River, and this panel could easily have included 25 or 30 people on it, including many people who are sitting in the audience with us. And our goal tonight is really twofold, I would say, to hear from the panelists where things stand politically and practically in the federal, state, and local efforts to remake the river, and in a more philosophical vein to ask what we want from the river, what we want it to be, what we see in it. I think importantly, how many different visions it is capable of bearing, and not least who in the end gets to decide. So we'll introduce the panelists, as I mentioned, in a bit, but first we're going to hear from 4 more Oxy students, all of them channeling Lewis McAdams to one degree or another, the founder of the Friends of the LA River, whose work and influence we really wanted to make special note of, even though Lewis couldn't join us tonight. So first, Maddie Toll and Amber Ty will each read a Lewis McAdams poem or a section of a Lewis McAdams poem about the river. And then 2 more students, Melissa Donaldson and Ella Fornari, will introduce an excerpt starring Lewis of a short film that they have been working on about the LA River. So please welcome them. They're coming from the back.
The founding of Friends of the Los Angeles River. Pat Peterson, Roger Wong, and I met Fred Fisher at the Old Challenge Dairy on Vineyard Street for early morning brandies and coffee. We were on our way down to the river for the first time. We carry heavy-duty wire clippers to cut through the fence inside the First Street Bridge, courtesy of Greg Gannon. Then we climb down the steep, cement-covered bank to the river. We don't know where we're going exactly. We walk upstream to where the Arroyo Seco flows into Los Angeles. This must have been one of the most beautiful places around here. Once a thicket, a confluence, an avalon at the meeting of year-round streams. Deer quiver at the edge of memory. Night herons splash. There are steelhead. We don't like to look backwards. Now there are railroad tracks on both banks of the river. 2 freeway bridges, the 110 and the 5, cross it. Through a tunnel where somebody is sleeping on a gray mattress in a torched VW van, the Arroyo meekly flows. Cement will turn back into sand someday. Today there's 30 guys with jackhammers leveling the pavement ahead of an airport runway paving machine. It makes an unholy noise, so we address ourselves to the river. We ask if we can speak on its behalf in the human realm. We can't hear the river saying no, so we get to work. News item. Devil's Gate Dam is renamed the Hahamunga Watershed Park. In Gabrielino, Hahamunga means flowing waters, fertile valley. Today, the Hahamunga flows into the Los Angeles northwest of downtown. What was the Los Angeles River called before the arrival of the Christian priests?
First breakthrough into public consciousness, anger, cats. I was editing videotape when the Times called up and asked me what did I think of Assemblyman Katz's idea of putting a freeway in the LA River. I felt like my forehead was exploding. I spit out my words in anger. Over our dead bodies. The reporter made me repeat it. After he hung up, I was mortified. I tried to call him back. I knew I'd been carried away in a cloud of fiery, self-righteous anger. I did this once before at a Bolinas school board meeting when I called somebody on the board a liar from the floor. The guy looked at me in shock. He was from Stinson Beach. I don't need this. I could see him thinking to himself. The reporter wouldn't take my call. I waited in dread for the next morning's paper. He used a quote, over our dead bodies. Guilty. But for the Friends of the Los Angeles River, it was a breakthrough. After that, people knew we were serious, and we knew we were serious too. 2 weeks after the school board meeting, the guy from Stinson quit the board, breaking the political logjam that had stopped us from building the new school. Finally, channeling William Blake, the tigers of wrath are more powerful than the horses of instruction. Guilty pleasures.
Hello, I'm Melissa Donaldson,
I'm Ella Fernari.
and we are in Professor Brodie Fox's documentary course at Occidental College, and we're putting together a documentary on the river. And we spoke with Lewis last week, and we decided to share some of our favorite clips with you all.
Just a figment of my imagination that I turned into something that actually... with it for the rest of my life, and I never did figure out why I knew that or what made me know that, but it was something. I mean, it probably never happened to me otherwise. Being around rivers is good for your thoughts. People want to. It's like building bridges. Building bridges is a really positive thing. People get into it. I mean, that's the pleasure is working with Michael Maltzan, the architect who's designing the new 6th Street Bridge. I mean, you know, people love bridges, just like people love water and love rivers. So you're definitely on the right side of the argument. It's not like it would be horrible to be a person that hates rivers. I saw it in the context of the LA River was just a figment of my imagination that I turned into something. The LA River was just a figment of my imagination that I turned into something that actually exists. And so sort of taking something, making the invisible visible is kind of the kind of magic I aspire to be a practitioner of. When I saw the river, I knew I was going to be involved with it for the rest of my life. And I never did figure out why I knew that or what made me know that. But it was something, I mean, it probably never happened to me otherwise. Being around rivers is good for your thoughts. People want to, it's like building bridges. Building bridges is a really positive thing. People get into it. I mean, that's the pleasure is working with Michael Maltzan, the architect who's designing the new 6th Street Bridge. I mean, you know, people love bridges, just like people love water and love rivers. So you're definitely on the right side of the argument. It's not like it would be horrible to be a person that hates rivers. I saw it in the context of art, as performance art, as a 40-year artwork to bring the river back to life. Now the river is clearly back to life, if it was ever not alive, but it certainly was shaky when I started. It seems a lot more firm now. Poetry and politics meet for me somewhere, they meet down by the river. They meet in a community gathering. I mean, I see that as the fundamental thing that full art is an invitation to come down to the river. You know, and that's where people want to be. I mean, we're 80% water. Of course we would want to be near the water. My original idea was I'd just convince people that the river could be something other than what it was. But I quickly realized that the first thing I had to do was convince people that it even existed, because it had been extirpated like a red-legged frog from the maps. You would look at a map of LA 25 years ago, and there would be nothing that said LA or Los Angeles River. It would usually say flood control channel. And changing the language, I think that was probably, if there was any single contribution that I've made, it's to change the language of saying the river was a flood control channel to changing it to the river is a river. I mean, and I obviously didn't do that alone, but I think that's been one of the fundamental changes that Friends of the Los Angeles River has created, that kind of change towards a more inspired monologue to an inspiring dialogue, hopefully. One of the things that's fun about what I do is try to, you know, be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And it's fun to work The LA River was just a figment of my imagination that I turned into something that actually exists. And so sort of taking something, making the invisible visible is kind of the kind of magic I aspire to be a practitioner of. The LA River was just a figment of my imagination that I've made. It's to change the language of something instead of part of the problem. And it's fun to work with people that are really just, that have a lot of enthusiasm and aren't dried up and burnt out. You know, that's the pleasure, that's the great pleasure of it. I think the next generation of question, I mean, that you guys represent, or Leela Higgins represents, or Cat, Super Cat. I am Julia Meltzer, people that are making waves in the river right now. I think that they are, their gift was to come along at the time that the momentum was growing to restore the river, or to create a new river. I'm very hesitant about using the word restore, even though I do use it sometimes. But it's really more about creating a new river. I mean, you have to, I think, to be effective and to be able to acknowledge the ecology, you have to think of it as a kind of new river. It's the only people you'd see along this stretch of the river were people collecting aluminum cans. You know, and now there's all these people in Italian riding outfits, and, you know, people, grandmas with abuelitas with strollers, and, you know, it's coming alive. You know, seeing the osprey dive and catch carp. You know, it's reviving a city, a kind of city of the imagination. I mean, all you got to do is add water. You don't even have to stir it.
Thank you to Melissa and Ella, and thanks for bearing with us with our technical issues. Let me invite all of our panelists to join me. Is Carol coming? Here she comes. Okay. So Carol, who's just arriving, she gets the first introduction. She directs Eric Garcetti's LA Riverworks team. She served as the project manager for and now implements the city's LA River Revitalization Master Plan, which I'll ask her to tell us a little bit more about. Next to her is Michael Maltzan, founder and design principal of the LA-based Michael Maltzan Architecture, who is working on the 6th Street Viaduct, which we'll hear about, also the architect of One Santa Fe near the river in the Arts District, and someone who's very thoughtful in his work and his writing about Los Angeles and these larger issues of the way the city's changing that I want to try to connect to these questions, you know, particular questions about the river. Barbara Romero is newly named Deputy Mayor, congratulations, of City Services in the office of Mayor Eric Garcetti. She was appointed to this position in March of this year after serving as a Board of Public Works Commissioner. Before that, she spent a decade working for the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, where she was Chief of Urban Projects and the Watershed Planning Division. To my immediate right, Julia Meltzer, a filmmaker and the director here at Clockshop, a multifaceted arts organization that works at the intersection of politics, urban space, and cultural production to explore the forces that shape our lived environment. So the five of us will have a conversation about some of the issues that I touched on, and get hopefully an update about where the efforts to remake the river stand, and also where we hope that they might go. I want to start by directing a couple of questions to Michael, who's brought some images of the 6th Street project, just as we did with Barbara Bester in the last conversation about housing, where she showed some images of the Blackbirds project in Echo Park, which is under construction. I wanted to start by allowing Michael to talk a little bit about this project. Tell us a little bit about the design competition first, and then your scheme.
The competition for the replacement of the 6th Street Bridge grew out of a lot of concern that the existing 6th Street Bridge, which is arguably the most iconic of the suite of bridges that Merrill Butler was involved in, the city engineer, a number of years ago, mostly during the City Beautiful movement. There was a lot of concern that the way that that was going to be replaced was with a more typical highway bridge. And that was really the way that the project was moving forward. And out of a lot of the concern about that, protests about that, the city, Bureau of Engineering, decided to run a larger competition, an international competition, to select a design team to design that replacement bridge.
And where did that impetus come from? I mean, that's not typical of how these kinds of public works projects happen in Los Angeles.
It's not, and actually it was the first of those types of competitions that they had ever done. So part of the challenge, I think, for the entire project at that beginning point was to figure out literally how to do a competition to achieve a significant result. I think the way it came about was that many people like Lewis were advocating strongly that the bridge was something more than conveyance from one side of the city to another, and it was clear that there was already a great deal of change imminent in the future of certainly those neighborhoods that surround the 6th Street Bridge. The Arts District was starting to grow significantly. Boyle Heights is becoming more and more certainly visible politically in the city. And the areas surrounding the river, including the Flats area, was something that was very much on people's minds. I would say that though the ongoing conversation about the river that was picking up more and more steam was also very much at the forefront of why people cared about it. It was the reality that the river, as Lewis said, finally becoming more than flood channel on the maps, was having the effect of making people very conscious of that place, and that those bridges were such a significant part of the identity of those neighborhoods and of the city as a whole. This is a good image to stop on, but those other images, I think, give you a sense of what we tried to do with the design of the bridge. Very simply, from an aesthetic standpoint, the 6th Street Bridge has those two main arches crossing the river. But what we realized was, as important as the crossing of the river was, that it was the connection across the entire 3,800 feet or so of the bridge that spoke to the bridge as being potentially more about the knitting together of what had been formerly separated, you could argue, separated parts of the city, not just physically, but I think culturally as well, socially as well. And the new bridge, the new design for the bridge, took those arches and in a sense just replicated them, multiplied them into this continuous chain or string of arches that was trying to say that while the crossing of the bridge, crossing of the river was in many ways the most important part of the bridge, that there was a non-hierarchical idea to the bridge, that the entire bridge was important, that the iconography of the arches really needed to span from Boyle Heights all the way to the Arts District.
And tell us who else is on the design team. They're not particularly the landscape architecture piece, but you're working with some other firms too.
We are, the larger team is managed by the large engineering firm, HNTB, which is a global engineering firm that specializes in infrastructure particularly. there is an engineer, Ted Zoli, who is a part of HNTB, MacArthur Fellow, works from New York, who was part of the initial conceptualization and design of the bridge and was a very important partner. Hargraves Associates are the landscape architects who we've been involved in from the very beginning, from the competition, especially one partner, Mary Margaret Jones. And Hargraves has made, in a sense, a kind of a specialty of the revitalization of rivers in cities, especially in North America, and have a great deal of expertise in the issues that surround that, including a lot of the technical issues, but also accessibility to what have often been rivers in cities where the cities have, over time, turned their backs to the river and now trying to reestablish a relationship with the river. A.C. Martin is a part of the larger urban design team as well. But it was really Hargraves and Ted Zoli who were the significant partners in the beginning of the project, the conceptualization of the project.
And tell us where it meets the river, what will it look like, how difficult was sort of forging that access, or are there still questions about?
This image is of what's come to be known as the Arts Plaza and River Gateway. It's on the west side of the river. There is a tunnel which is a part of the existing 6th Street viaduct, 6th Street Bridge, which is one of the only points that you can get to the river from the city itself. It goes under the rail tracks. One of the complexities around this part of the river is how many parts of urban infrastructure, privately controlled, separate you from the river. There's Amtrak, MTA, Union Pacific, Metrolink train rails that you can't cross to get to the river. And this tunnel is the place where you can connect to. It's the place that almost every movie that you've ever seen about the river, that's the main access point. What we're trying to do is to enhance that, shorten the tunnel so that it's not so forbidding, create stronger connections in the river itself to make it more accessible to what is hopefully a continuous bike path that runs or will run all the way up, especially north of the 6th Street Bridge. And on the west side, to establish the space under the bridge, not as the underneath of another highway, but to start to create more an urban room with a big roof over it, which happens to be the bridge, and develop it into more of an amphitheater-like setting so that events, even events like this, could take place in that setting, as well as allow it to be used as a civic community plaza for arts events, gatherings, celebrations in the city as a whole.
And what's the time frame for the completion?
Construction for the entire project has literally started, although it's not so glamorous. It's mostly intersection improvements right now, but it is the beginning. Those have to be done to allow for the bridge to be closed and work to take place. The bridge will start to be closed. Demolition will start towards the end of the summer, August, with the goal of completion of the bridge in early 2019.
And the funding comes from?
Federal government administered through Caltrans, but it is a city Bureau of Engineering project.
And let me step back to,
I think
yeah,
that's
go
an
ahead.
important point. When you talk about, why did we have a big competition? I think, residents and river stakeholders seized the opportunity that Bureau of Engineering was just looking at it as part of the infrastructure upgrades. And the beauty of it was they were also running the river project. So when they started hearing those voices and the political will saw the connections, they realized they could try to integrate how we make the connections down to the river integrated into the project and see how much of it can we push this federal funding to help us with some of those connections. So I think that was a seized opportunity that came, I think, from from the river stakeholders.
Now, to the extent that it's possible to do this in rather simplified form, I'd like to ask you and Carol Armstrong to tell us where there's so many different efforts that are connected, the federal effort through the Army Corps of Engineers, so-called Alternative 20, you mentioned the revitalization master plan, there's a county plan also. Can you tell us in relatively simplified terms how those efforts connect to one another and where they stand?
Okay, yep. Happy Earth Day. Nice to be here at the LA River. I know you love the river, you wouldn't be here. And I really appreciate that. It's a cold one. So Alternative 20 is the plan of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's the LA River Ecosystem Restoration Feasibility Study, also known as the ARBOR study, for the area that it focuses on. And ARBOR stands for the area with restoration benefits and opportunities for revitalization. Yes, it does. And it focuses on an 11-mile stretch of the river, right? So the first 32 miles of the river flow through the city of Los Angeles. The entire river is, as you said, debatably 51 miles. So the county's 96 plan focused on all 51 miles. The city's 2007 plan looks at the first 32 miles. And the Army Corps study looks at an 11-mile portion of those first 32. There will be a quiz. Okay, so...
And we will all fail.
Right. So the Army Corps channelized the river in the name of flood protection starting in the 1930s. And the channelization of the river basically caused a lot of environmental damage and took away a lot of its ecological value. So the Army Corps of Engineers in recent decades has a mission to go back into the places where it has flood control projects and to determine if there is a federal interest in investing to restore the ecological values in those places. So in 2005, Congress asked the Army Corps to see if it was possible to do that in Los Angeles, and they said yes, that there was a federal interest. So the study was started in 2006 with the city as local sponsor. So now, almost 10 years later, we have a set of recommendations about how to restore the river. And we went public with that in the fall of 2013. And the Army Corps was recommending what was called Alternative 13. The public overwhelmingly supported Alternative 20. So Mayor Garcetti went to Washington and said, we will settle for nothing less than Alternative 20. And we came to an agreement on Alternative 20, and now we're going to Corps headquarters this summer to get them to approve it, but very importantly, approve what the cost share will be. And so our pushback is that we want it to be equitable. We deserve that it should be equitable, and right now it's not looking that equitable, so we're not done.
So best case scenario for the city is what kind of a breakdown in cost share would you say? Or what are you hopeful to achieve?
The Urban Rivers option.
So we're, when the colonel came here, when the general came a couple months ago, we basically said we have, they usually in their plan have one cost ratio. We said we have a third option, and it's the urban option. And part of the challenge of why they're asking us, they're asking us to take a bigger percentage is because typically the land acquisition and the cleanup of the properties that we have to deliver to them so then they can do the restoration is on the local sponsor. So that means because the city, you know, land is more expensive in LA than it is in some of the areas across the country, and it's also dirtier. So because of that, that's where the costs increase. So they don't have a formula because they look at it from habitat units, and that's it in terms of what's a good cost per ratio benefit analysis. They're not looking at the park equity issue. They're not looking at the density. They're not looking at a lot of the issues that we know are, you know, is that our land is, you know, that we are encountered with in our 32-mile stretch. So, and the 11-mile stretch, which is for me the 134 to, you know, First Street Bridge, that part of it is significantly industrial on a lot of the edges on the rivers, which means...
Right, which brings us to the G2 parcel, which we walked over to see earlier. on the one hand, an incredible opportunity, almost 45 acres right in the center of the city, but significant remediation will have to happen there. Give us an update about where those negotiations stand and
Well, negotiations are active. I think for some of you who are here, over 10 years ago, Union Pacific wasn't a willing seller. So having them just be a willing seller and having them have discussions about negotiating, I'm personally working on, I'm not in the negotiations, but I'm personally working to figure out, the policy issues. Typically a city, a public agency doesn't take dirty land. So how do we, and of course, if we're asking Union Pacific to give us this land as is, to give us a credit for the dirty land, how do we indemnify them? So it's changing the culture in the city of how do we do it? Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get it. Or do we stay on our laurels and say, fine, we don't agree. It's going to cost us 3 times more than what you're willing to give us as a credit for the cleanup, or we lose it to private development. So those are the challenges that we're facing right now is what can we do to get it? So we're, the biggest challenges is what the appraisal costs should be, what should the cost be, and how much credit are the big issues that most of you who have been following G2, know that it's still at the same place, but it's, for someone like me, I'm looking, how do we become creative and look at bringing other sources, bringing in the state, as, Sean, the other parcels that are there were purchased with state support. So how do we bring them in as an active partner? Because it's not only in one council district, we have to get 8 votes to say that it has regional significance. So that's the additional challenges that we're facing as we have an opportunity because they're a willing seller, but at what cost? And
assuming it's a big if, but if those obstacles are surmounted, you have some remediation, what's the vision for that piece? Is it all parkland, open space? Is it a mix of some development, some open space, contiguous with the other open spaces, Bowtie parcel that's there, and the state park?
The vision in the Army Corps study is that we tried to preserve as much as possible for restoration. So this is one of the only opportunities for us to take down the walls and actually have so that's something that we have, stakeholders have said that's important. We have a new council member. Obviously, if we purchase it, if we get it, which it would be one of the things that is on my to-do list. We would have to go back out and talk to the residents and confirm that the vision that was included in the master plan, that is included in the Army Corps study, it still stands solid. What is the consensus? And then, then finding the money to not only clean it up, because that's what's the hold right now. We might have enough money to buy it, but how long is it going to sit there? What are some interim uses that we could do? Do we phase it in? Even right now in the M&D that we did, we only actually did an M&D for 10 acres because the city the engineers and the attorneys wouldn't let us say the larger picture because we didn't have money for the entire site. So they didn't want us to also give a false expectations that we're going to buy it and tomorrow we're going to get started.
It gives you a sense of the complexity of all of these issues. Julie, I wanted to ask you about what these changes along the river look like up close. You've been here in this spot watching things change from your perspective. How has it looked from here?
I think it's been generally all over exciting. But there's in this neighborhood in Frogtown that we've been here for 12 years, there are mixed feelings. People feel, I think most people walking in saw that there was a protester on the corner. People feel that, I think maybe this is simplifying, but a lot of people sometimes equate change with gentrification. And the people who have lived in this neighborhood for a long time have not been treated well by the city, and feel that very much. And so I think there's that component here, but then I also think that among many residents, there's a feeling that this change could really benefit the community and people are excited about it. I mean, my experience on this block has been that when we came here, the end of the block was a place where a lot of people just hung out and the bike path was not repaved, so no one used it, and it was just a place that felt like what Lewis said, almost like a non-place. And that has changed significantly. Like, we see a lot of people come through this neighborhood now who might not have ever known that it was here. And there's not a lot of people just hanging out doing whatever they were doing. There's a lot of people selling drugs at the end of our street. That's not there anymore. So I think for the neighborhood, that's been positive. But yeah, there's a lot of debate here.
One of the things that came up in the conversation I had with Alex Cohen on Take Two this morning, looking ahead to this event, was about gentrification, of course, but about the larger question of how there's so much complexity of the public piece. Also, this being a city where the speculative investment of real estate development is allowed to move in much more quickly to these neighborhoods than say, a public body is able to establish a sort of set of design guidelines or a vision for a neighborhood. So Michael, maybe I'll start with you, having done the One Santa Fe project down by the river in the Arts District, another neighborhood that's going through that kind of change by the river. What can the city do to kind of accelerate its process, or hold that sort of speculative energy at bay before we look up 5 years from now, and even if we're making the right choices about the river, there's a wall of not so interesting condo projects, apartment buildings that are separating these communities from the riverbanks just at the moment that we're trying to increase public access to the river.
I think that one of the challenges always in exactly that kind of situation, the difference between, for instance, gentrification and change, is how you curate complexity, which is in many ways what you're asking to create, that neighborhoods, infrastructure, environmental issues, sustainability issues come together to create a real mix, to create something which is incredibly dynamic. And I think that probably can't be done solely by the city or by government. It can't be solely done by developers. There has to be some kind of a partnership that starts to take place between them. And I don't know that there's one particular avenue to allow that. Certainly, public and community pressure is important, but that public and community pressure can't be solely about trying to stop change from happening. But I think you can demand that creativity is somehow employed to create a much stronger, more real, vibrant response to that.
But you would agree, I would guess that this has not been a city where the public side of that equation has been historically very robust. So the question is, how can the public side exert some
When you say public
role
side,
there?
do you mean, for instance, the community in the public, or are you talking about the governmental public?
Both. But I mean, particularly the latter, I would say, in terms of shaping the way that neighborhoods are growing.
Well, one thing that certainly is a strong driver, and we saw it at One Santa Fe, is that as, for instance, the river starts to become a stronger and stronger amenity, it is able to be used as a lever with developers to be seen as a real value to connect to and to capture. The large portal that runs through the center of One Santa Fe was something that most developers would not have generally done in a market rate apartment complex. But the reason for that was twofold. One, the potential for future connections to the river, because that was very much on people's minds, and people like Lewis in the design committee meetings in the city made that a significant point. And also that the that there was the chance for a Metro Red Line station in that area. Those are two components that government or super government agencies do control, and their proximity and the fact that they are being seen more and more as an attribute, and that developers want to connect to that, meant that, and there was a receptive side in government to those ideas, meant that it started to be a real value for the developer to institute it and allow them to do some things that they might not have been able to do otherwise. So there was a negotiation going on there that used the river and transit as a chip, in a sense, to allow the developer to do some things that they wanted to do and to provide a much larger set of design elements that were really at the scale of the civic, of the public.
Can I jump in here just
Of
really
course.
quick? I want to talk about how excited I am that Barbara Romero is our deputy mayor. I don't know how many people know that she was a planning commissioner in the previous administration, and her commission passed the Rio and the River Improvement Overlay District twice, and City Council didn't. And the City Council just adopted it in this administration last year, and that's significant. It's the River Improvement Overlay District extends along the entire river within the city, and it will have design guidelines. And I want to call out my river sister Claire Bowen in the planning department. Our master plan recommended not only the Rio district, but the guidelines. And Claire is embedding the guidelines in the recode process that the city is going through right now. I'm not saying that we're as far as we need to be in terms of design, but we are making, strides forward. And ever since we set out to revitalize the river, we established a ZI flag that would let us know when properties were going to be redeveloped near the river, or new ones would come in, or there would be significant redevelopment. So we started to have conversations with people. And I do think that we'd be underestimating our river family if we didn't also recognize that whenever anything happens along the river, it seems like everybody and their cousin is paying attention. There's a lot of informed, active people who have very strong opinions about design, so there is that's why we're here tonight, right? It's evidence that there is a very strong and robust dialogue already happening, so I don't think that we should discount that.
One thing, when you said, how do you distinguish the three from the county's master plan? For me, it's the county, when they did in '96, they just focused on the public right-of-way, which is like, let's just say the bike path. They just said, let's open up the bike path and do a little greenway next to the bike path. When the city came in, we looked not only at the river channel, but we look at least a mile, and in some areas up to 2.5, 3 miles of looking at some of the land use of how we can revitalize those neighborhoods. And the Corps looked at just the center, the channel. How do we restore that piece of it? So I think for me, the government set up some of the framework. And now when people say, well, Barbara, there was, in the master plan, there was 240 projects listed. The 6th Street Viaduct wasn't one of those projects. But it was capitalized and catalyzed as a river project because it had all the same elements. So I think, and people always say, oh, I have this other project, and people are doing their own organic projects. And that's, I think, the role of government, is to set up the framework. And now we're seeing the gaps, like where are we going to do affordable housing? Dealing with gentrification. Our innovation team just received like $2.5 million from the Bloomberg Foundation to not only look citywide at the complex issue of gentrification and coming up with some solutions. And obviously the river is going to be one of those case studies, because they are connected. As people are asking for change and upgrades in their neighborhoods, they're also asking us, that tension have to coexist.
Is there a way for the city, perhaps as part of that design review and the overlay process, or in other ways, to take access to the river at certain particular points that would be very valuable to developers and allow certain different height or different access? I'm thinking of the High Line, for example, which allowed 2 projects to use the air rights above the High Line, the Standard Hotel and Neil Denari's condo project as a way to pay for and catalyze some of the development that communities are hoping for. In other words, is there a way to take this developer momentum and use it to produce other changes? And is that something that's on the table as far as the city is concerned?
I think when Carol talked about that the real guidelines, the reason we don't have design guidelines, I think, as a former planning commissioner, is there wasn't the stakeholder interests, attention to it, the developer interests, which means we didn't have the council, we didn't have the leadership, the political support. So I think we're at a time that I think they're all aligned, and we're primed to really look at that. I mean, I worked on a park here, in 2007, Marsh Park, where half the people that came to the community meeting said, "You're crazy, you're not going to put a park here because everybody here you're just building it for the gang members." And then the other people had said, "Well, if you build it, this is what I want for my neighborhood, it's our neighborhood." So even a small 5-acre park wasn't even something that was tangible and possible for this neighborhood. Today, that we talked about a community park, people would be telling you what they actually want, because now we have informed Elysian Valley residents.
In general, design review in LA is something that I'm very wary about, but this is such a particular landscape, and the pace of change is so quick that if we begin to have more projects that we're starting to, like the ones that we're starting to see that are kind of generic apartment and condo projects that look like the ones that are lining every boulevard, that I think would be a particular shame in this landscape.
But I think part of that is that often there's lots of reasons why I think you get that very generic type of building. But in the places where it's possible to try to invent something, to bring creativity together in such a way that you have the possibility of actually inventing something. One of the challenges has been that there are not that many mechanisms in the city to put together different ideas or different agencies in a way to move a thicker idea forward. And I think that's one of the things that everybody's very excited about Barbara and her position, is that there's a voice now in a role of consequence that you could potentially bring complex, divergent issues together and present them in such a way, and there would be a mechanism to help navigate through what has isolated a lot of possibilities.
And from your point of view, somebody who's moved these projects through, what are the most significant changes that would make that possible, make it feasible?
It depends on the scale, but I think that, for instance, in something like the 6th Street Bridge, one of the things that struck me early on was that it was as if we had laid every complex piece of the city in alignment and then drew a skewer, stuck a line through it, because you have DWP with the high power lines, you have Army Corps of Engineers, you have all those railways I mentioned, you certainly have the Arts District, you have Boyle Heights, you have Caltrans with the 5 freeway and the 101 freeway. It just goes on and on and on. Metro, exactly. And the ability to have a voice that helps coordinate. For instance, if you start to see a possibility for creating real connection within the city that would move across those boundaries, you need somebody to be able to help connect those different agencies in such a way that they're talking to each other and allow you to literally to create a pathway to move those ideas forward. In that sense, it's not that complex, but it is difficult, and it takes some mechanism to navigate through these different agencies.
That was one of the conclusions that we came to in the discussion about housing, that the solutions were actually fairly straightforward. It was a matter of political will rather than a kind of complexity. I think the situation here is more complex, though, for all the reasons that you just laid out, the number of things that were threaded through this landscape in the post-war, not just the channelization of the river, but the amount of infrastructure, the prison facilities, all of the things that were sort of put in this landscape that no one was really paying close attention to. And now that we are paying that kind of attention to, we're realizing that that legacy of what we built there, what we left there, what we have to clean up in all the ways that you've described. But from the,
Can
yeah,
I ask a quick
sure.
question? I'm just curious, this is for Barbara. Are there other American cities that are as complicated as Los Angeles? I mean, because I really relate to that. There's all these different layers. And like in San Antonio, for example, where the river was revitalized there, do you know, are there all those layers of different agencies to deal with?
Yes, and I mean, in San Antonio, if you talk to some people, they say, well, not in our neighborhood, not that part of our neighborhood. Is that suitable for something like downtown Los Angeles? It's not suitable for, is it suitable for Studio City? So I think part of when anybody comes out to visit from worldwide that come to visit the LA River, and we get a lot, you know, we have a river tour that we have to do now, and everyone always talks about the scale, that not only do we might have some of the same issues and complexities, but we also are talking about so many different, the scale is massive, and all the niches of neighborhoods that it can't be uniform. We can't have the High Line in one way that when you think of the High Line, it's grand, but it's pretty
very short
in comparison. And you know, and ours, you know, the navigation of all the complexities, I think it's
No,
I don't know, but
I
I don't
agree.
think so.
In general, I'm really loath to make any Highline comparisons in LA because I think it's a different project for New York, but in particular the air rights and the idea of a certain kind of verticality and height to help promote a different kind of landscape elsewhere is something that we need to be talking about.
Well, I wanted to just jump on there a little. We looked at some cases around the world, particularly in Europe, with similar Mediterranean-type climates, and where they've revitalized their rivers and restored them ecologically. And almost in every case, they're tied to a transportation project, whether it be a rail project or tunneling of roadways or something like that. And you know, when you talk about transportation, particularly in Los Angeles, when you talk in the billions, nobody blinks. You talk about restoration of the river at 1.35 billion. Oh my God, we can't do it, right? Well, if ever there was a time for us to look at all this constrained, you know, all this constraint from the transportation system and look at how we can revitalize both together, it's now. And I think it's also important to note that we're sitting in the district of Councilman Mitch O'Farrell, and he is from Oklahoma, and he always cites the Oklahoma City case. And Oklahoma City is kind of a second-tier city compared to Los Angeles, I think we would all agree. But yet they agreed to tax them, right? Sorry, Oklahoma.
There might be some angry Oklahomans in the crowd when we open it up to
Yikes,
questions.
where did I park? No, but they agreed to tax themselves, and now the waterfront in Oklahoma City is beautiful. They're building a Native American museum, and they have Olympic-scale boating. You know, if they can do it in Oklahoma City, we should have done it a while ago, right? But one thing that the councilman has done is he has issued for the first time in the city council a motion to look at the feasibility of an enhanced infrastructure finance district along the LA River. So now that we don't have CRAs anymore, it's value capture, right? A lot of people think, oh, it's a tax. No, it's tax increment financing, which is what our master plan recommended. And every time you talk about a project of this scale, you have to consider it. Because when that value comes in, you capture it, and then you reinvest it to benefit a public good like the Los Angeles River and the projects associated with it. That's when you start to talk about what will the density be, what will it look like, what will we allow, what's tolerable. And when you have that kind of a system, you implicitly have that dialogue publicly.
And I think also if you think of bikes as a central part of the transportation planning in the city now, and that is a kind of spine for the bike network, that's a significant potential, particularly in density, close to downtown, where people can do most of their, you know, get around mostly by bike in a way that hasn't really been possible in neighborhoods connected to the river. So it's a little chilly. There's a lot more we could talk about, but in the interest of time, I do want to open it up to see if there are some questions from all of you. I think there's a microphone. If not, we can use one of ours, but can't really see. But
There's a question there.
thank you. It doesn't sound like it's on, but all right. I'll try to repeat the question.
Oh, thanks. I don't expect an answer to this question, but with the governor's proclamation of a crisis, a water drought going on right now, and listening to the conversation all about the land adjacent to the river, why don't we consider purifying the water in the river the way so many other cities have? So if we need drinking water, we can use the river, but we're actually invigorating the quality of the water if we start to purify it and make it better. Right now, there are open pipes going from industrial enterprises leading directly into the river, which could be stopped, but they're going on right now. And
So the question is, I think we get the gist of it. Thank you. The governor's talk about drought leads to the question of whether we can change our attitude about how the river water is treated, but maybe you can talk about what kind of water is in the river now for those people who don't understand. A lot of it comes from water treatment plants, probably most of it.
I think is it 80% comes from Donald Tillman, so it is treated water. It's not to drinking standards. So one of the things that our Bureau of Sanitation and Department of Water and Power are actually in the are planning, how do they take more of actually the water that goes into the river and use it for recycling to just and put it back into our aquifer, which means we're going to have less water for the river, but there's also the missed opportunity the water that you're referring to, we're going to get. I think so for me, the recipe is being honest about what we can actually have you guys help influence. If it's only a portion of the project, allowing you to help input in that piece, because there are limitations to either the funding drives a lot of the way these projects are built. So, so I think that for me, overseeing 15 departments and great streets and LA River is what I'm trying to foster, that kind of to the general managers, is go out there and be honest about what you really need input on. Don't be disingenuous in it, because people are going to be upset regardless.
Right. Carol?
Well, I just wanted to add to that and say that it's easy to say no, right? Wait till you're the one trying to develop a river project and everybody around you hates it. I feel like in a dynamic city like Los Angeles, it's amazing that we're like, well, city, what are you going to do about it? When are you going to do something about it? We're waiting for that design czar. When's that design czar coming? What is a design czar?
When is that design czar
Right.
coming?
But what does that mean, czar, right? Does LA need a czar of anything? No. We're a messy democracy. And so we have a word, I know some people hate it, it's called riverly. When you talk about something is riverly or not riverly, it's not good or bad, but you have an idea of what it is. Is it what you want to see along the river, or isn't it? But why don't you just organically start talking about what you like, what you want to see? Start Instagramming it, put it up there, form a design committee, call yourself the design czar, whatever you want. But instead of always saying no to the solutions that come from the public sector, it's certainly high time that we start hearing it, what's good. That's how you turn no to yes, to positive, I think.
I think, John, my answer to that question would be to say that the city needs to put forth a vision for the river that does include development, that doesn't pretend that this is just about restoration, that acknowledges that there's a land rush going on and there's a huge amount of speculative energy, and tries to use that speculative energy, as I was saying, in a positive way. And maybe some of that, and that says, here's some way that development can incorporate forward-looking architecture. Maybe not all of it will look riverly to everyone. It might look decidedly unriverly to some people if you're talking about projects of significant height along the river. But as long as it's being used toward a larger vision of what will happen, and doesn't pretend that development is not part of this picture.
That's a really good point. One of the things that I think, I'm asking all the consultants who worked on the master plan to come back and tell us what would you have done differently in the master plan to produce? What things were held back because the political climate wasn't there. You know, what findings do you have? Because as we're looking forward to now, people are asking, you know, was that even part of the plan, the economic development piece? I mean, we, you know, a handful of us met with, you know, LA Business Councils came to us and said, we want to play a role. What do you guys need help with? And we said simply that. No one has looked at the river from an economic development. Nobody has really done an analysis. How viable is it? Because really at first, it was an environmental, I mean, Lewis came in and saying, you know, he just wanted to restore nature and the environmental, it was an environmental project. And for a long time, all of us who were talking about the one-dimensional piece of the river, not looking at other aspects of it. But now, and so people are saying, you know, you're holding back. It's like, well, part of it was we didn't plan for it to have this. So now we have a responsibility. I mean, the planning department, you know, as a public works commissioner, I went to the general manager and the director and I said, I need you to play a role in the river, because there hasn't been a role for the planning department, like a direct role to say, there hasn't been a direction by council to say, I want you to, besides the real, you know, how do we do exactly what you said? And do we have an economic development team? So now as a deputy mayor, I can go to my colleague who's overseeing economic development planning and say the same thing and say, you need to weigh in and you need to play a role and we need to assign staff to this.
And also to have a larger vision in a city where so much of the planning decision-making happens at the level of the council district and the council members, planning deputies, and so forth. And that sort of horse trading that leads to kind of piecemeal development is obviously at odds with planning a piece of the city that can, you know, run through so many different neighborhoods, even if it does require different solutions in different neighborhoods. But still having that overarching vision runs counter to the ways that we've done a lot of planning in this city.
Well, in a way, what you're asking is for it to not be some. Lewis referred to the way that he was changing the language, even to creating a river as opposed to restoring a river. And it strikes me that what you're really asking for is, or saying is that the project isn't about recreating or creating the river. It's really about creating the city and expanding literally outside the banks of the river what the influence of the river has now become, so that it does start to accommodate a much broader vision of what the future of the city looks like, because the future of the river is one thing, but clearly its effect now with all of the potential development is that this is probably the opportunity to look at what the newest version, the newest image of what the city actually is. There isn't another place in the city that is as condensed and intense in how many different very real issues it's taking on that are confronting the city as a whole.
I think that's a really perfect place to conclude, because I think one of the goals of the project was to give the city a platform for having some of those conversations about what we hope the city will be in a place that hasn't been so great at talking about itself or advancing a kind of collective vision. Those are conversations that are sometimes difficult to have in Los Angeles. So with that, let me thank the panelists for being here. Let me thank Clockshop and Julia for hosting us. Sean Woods for getting out there on his crutches and helping lead the tour. Everyone who came out tonight, particularly those of you who went to the tour and came here for the conversation. And finally, to everyone at Occidental College, especially my students, thank you so much for all of these conversations.